Mr. Rainwater.
Hey there, Joe.
Today we're going to be bad to the bone.
What are we going to do?
We're breaking rules, or at least talking about it. So I was going to start right off with the question of, what is your favorite rule that you just say, fuck it, and just completely ignore?
Oh God. Let's see. Specifically with creative stuff?
Sure.
Or anything.
No, I don't want you to admit to any legal legal stuff on this.
No, I have an expired license plate I need to take care of. But yeah, I think. Excuse me 1 second. I think a main thing that I oftentimes, I don't know if it's really a rule necessarily, but I feel like with genre, I'm kind of been breaking rules with Trailer Park Warlock a lot.
Okay.
Especially because it started as a comedy and like it's totally everywhere else, like it's not. Genre stuff is something where I really like to break a lot of rules, and I really give zero fucks. And I know that it's actually an issue, I do think that it's actually an issue if I wanted to have a bigger readership than I do have. Because there is something to be said to the idea of when you stick to genre, you give people stuff to expect, and you're not giving them too many surprises, which can be an issue. It could be an issue when somebody goes into a show expecting it to be like, like a vampire horror or whatever, and suddenly they're given like a dramedy about two random people who aren't even vampires, So not necessarily that I'm doing anything as extreme as that, but I think when you look at the beginning of Trailer Park Warlock versus where it is now, it's very different and has grown. It's grown in a totally different direction from where it started. And I think that I definitely look at that as breaking a rule in regards to keeping a consistent tone, I guess, or keeping a consistent approach to the story. And I'm, like I said, like those are the kind of rules that I do like to break. I like to break tones, or I like to break rules in regards to changing tone. I know that that's a thing for a lot of people. That's just like, you don't go there. Like I really liked that about Cloud Atlas as a movie, that you have one story that's like total drama, then like sci-fi, then like a retirement center comedy. Like it's so all over the place that for a lot of people it turned them off. For me, I loved it because it was completely different. It was weird. It was interesting. And I totally understand why people don't like it, but I just love seeing rules broken in that way, and especially when they're done in a way that's for lack of a better word, masterful. It's at least done in a way where it's not just completely fucked,
Who directed that movie?
That was Wachowski. Those are the Wachowski.
Was it both of them? Or
I believe it was both of them.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So it was another team effort. Okay. Well, I mean, we know the Wachowskis are fucking masters at what they're doing. I mean, sometimes, when you got the chains on from the studio, you can only do so much.
Yeah.
You can only, work within the constraints of what you're given. But we do know from their prior works when there was less limitations on them or less control, or maybe more control, who knows, that they are masterfully capable of executing things on a
going
high quality
outside
level.
of like going way outside of the comfort zone, right? Of like what Hollywood would want. And I think, were you going to say something else, Joe?
Well, I wanted to ask about that. I wanted to see who directed it. And then I also wanted to say, the chances are they had good reason for doing it, which I think is like the point. Like, we're going to skip to the ending right now of this episode, which is, why should you break a rule?
Yeah.
And the reason is because you have a good damn reason for it. And I have no doubt in my mind that the Wachowskis know what rule they're breaking and why they're breaking it. Even when it comes to something like a tonal jump, because in the hands of the wrong director, it just becomes that statement where people are like, "Oh, this movie doesn't know what it is." Does that make sense? You know what I mean? Whereas when you watch it with like the Wachowskis and the chair, it's like, no, they jumped from this tone to that tone because they have to, because blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
But a lesser director, they're just going to be like, this is just shit.
In Cloud Atlas in particular, you can get away with that because you have definitive different timelines that all these stories are taking place across. So you have a very definitive excuse for why you can say that, because each time has its own mood, its own atmosphere, its own required setting that's trying to establish. In the same way that, like, so you've probably seen like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, right?
Oh, absolutely. I loved it.
So like in the same way that like in that movie, all the different Spider-Men have their own particular ways that they're conveyed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
they're animated and drawn, and yeah.
Exactly. And that's one of my favorite. I mean, it can be rule breaking to a certain extent to like mix media or whatever, or mix rendering types, whatever you want to call it. But it can be very effective when you're using it to tell a certain aspect of a story, which is like, oh, these are people from totally different worlds from each other. So the very fabric of their being is completely different from each other.
I like to think that sometimes when you break rules like that, or like how the Wachowskis did, breaking rules is what defines an artist. Sometimes, like we talk about the artist signature a lot on this show, and we never really kind of get into what really defines an artist signature, but it really comes down to what rules that artist has decided to toss out the window and never have to explain themselves why. Like, you understand when you're watching it that they're doing it for a reason, but they don't ever have to explain themselves, and they consistently do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like one of the beautiful things about it, I just got done rewatching Midnight Mass for like the 12th time. And there's a particular aspect of the show that is very clear what horror subgenre this show is taking place in. But much like how in zombie movies, they will not say the word zombie ever. They never say this particular word throughout the entire series, even though every single trope seems to be that they're following every single trope for that particular genre. And you don't care. You know what I mean? Because there's so much else going on. It's like, all right, well, they're not going to say it, but I know what I'm watching. I understand it. I'm more involved with that. And that's the beautiful thing that I've started noticing about Mike Flanagan works, is that he never just comes out and says, well, this is a this. He really just kind of like, this is the story that happens, and these are the characters that it happens to. And you don't give a shit if it breaks some of the rules of that particular genre, because in essence, it never names itself. So it's like, well, it never called itself this. It's never called itself a witch movie or a vampire movie or a werewolf movie or whatever it may be. So, I mean, technically he can kind of get away with it. And I love that he's kind of got that mentality where it's like, well, I'm just not gonna, cater to the expectations of what people want by not labeling myself. And that's like a great thing that I love about his particular works. Watching, that kind of thing happen, it releases me from those expectations as an audience member, because we've talked about genre and how, like, if I'm sitting down for a horror movie, you better fucking scare me. Like, that's the number one rule. But then if I know what the subgenre is, then I have particular tropes and cliches in my head that, whether I want them or not, I'm still expecting them. So when I don't get them, it does feel like a disservice to some extent.
Sure.
But then if you're capable enough as an artist, after a while, I realize I don't really care. You know what I mean? Like
Oh yeah.
I'm more involved with what you're giving me than what I expected. And I think that's the mark of when a great artist is at work. And so you talk about how you kind of jump tones and like you've transitioned. I liked before how when you were talking about what Trailer Park Warlock has grown into, because that's
Yeah.
the key word there is grown, as opposed to, you know, you jumped different tones. You grew from one tone to the other. And that happens with time, right? With real estate. In
Oh yeah.
terms of storytelling, it's like, well, we've explored every corner of this house. Let's go to another room. And,
Yeah.
you know, like at that point, the audience is like, all right, yeah, because I'll be bored if we look at that other corner again. We've already checked out this chair. You know what I mean? So
Oh yeah.
it's
No,
very, go ahead.
it was one of those things where I think I could definitely see that there were a lot of readers who had the expectation that it was going to be something more like Rick and Morty or some other sort of like, you know, like an animated sitcom sort of thing where we always reset at the beginning of every episode and all that stuff. And there's so much of that. To me, I felt like I would rather go in a different direction and build it more in the direction of something closer to maybe, you know, a more extended story in regards to building the world out and building the characters out. And that's, for me, that's what it kind of turned into, is wanting to build more on the characters. And that's where for me that story has grown a lot. And like you're saying, yeah, I've in general I've recognized that I've grown as an artist, and I've been able to do, because I trailed away from that, I was able to do things that I otherwise wouldn't have done otherwise. And that to me is the big appeal of breaking rules, because a lot of times, like, effective artists aren't even really breaking rules. What they are is they're breaking apart sort of their own assumptions and conceptions in regards to, you know, that signature, or sort of how they identify themselves. Because that is, I think that is the biggest, really is the biggest pitfall for most creative people, is getting caught up into what you think of yourself, because you're going to get tired of it at some point. You're going to want to change in some point. And it may require for you to make that change, that you start breaking your own rules, but also that you start breaking rules of things that you thought were necessary, or you took as granted as part of the artistic process. And that second part's not the easiest thing in the world, right? Because, I mean, both you and me trained in an art school, right? We have so many different roles that we were taught. And so many of them are very important. 180 rule is probably the one that you really can't break that one. And I haven't seen too many examples of that being broken in an effective manner. And I guess to give more definition to what that is for people who don't understand, the 180 rule is the idea that, like, let's say that you have a character who's on like the left side of the screen. You have to make sure that whatever shots you take afterwards, once you've established that they don't break the motion or that particular direction that the character is facing. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of describing it, Joe. But
the idea is that you establish, not the real estate, the word I already used this evening. You establish positions of where everybody is in the area that you're filming. And if you cut or transition somehow to them in another position, not like if they shift their shoulder from up to down, even though that is jarring in itself. The idea is you're never trying to take your viewer out of your story and have them paying attention to the craft of what you're doing. So when you are cutting between two different shots, if you change something too drastically, it will make them break from what's going on in the scene. And that's what ruins storytelling. You know what I mean? It's like if you're telling a story to somebody at the kitchen table, and then all of a sudden someone drops a dish.
Yeah.
Like you really had them on the edge of their seat, and then someone dropped their dish, and it's like, oh, look over there.
Yeah.
And that ruins it. So
another example would be like, the stormtrooper shoots at Han Solo and the laser bolt comes from the left to the right. If it's going towards Han Solo, you're not going to want it to you don't want to reverse it and have it go right to left. You want it to continue going left to right. To continue that flow of action, because otherwise it looks disorienting. You don't know where everybody is located in regards to the environment.
Yeah.
And ultimately in cinema, especially, you're just stitching together the environment.
But you can break these things. So like if you go and watch like the Doctor Strange movie when they're in like the mirror dimension and all that kind of nonsense, perfect example of when you can do that.
Sure.
Because the audience is expecting that. You know what I mean? They're expecting things to be flipped upside down, crazy, going different directions, this and that. But when you're, having when you're watching like a movie like The Conversation, when it's just two people at a dinner table talking, if you need to transition where you want to put somebody on the other side of it, you're going to need cutaway shots. And like that's a way to change the 180, the distribution of where everybody is in the composition, but you have to use that. You can't just, skip over that part. And that's the thing a lot of people kind of disregard. And that applies to storytelling too, is figuring out, if my character is here emotionally and then in the next scene they're here emotionally, it's like, well, wait a minute. How far can I jump with that?
Right.
If my character's dad just died in one scene and they're very emotional about it, whether they're happy or sad or angry or whatever it may be, if in the next scene they are the polar opposite, you are drawing attention to that particular thing. And so if you don't have a reason for it, that's bad filmmaking. That's bad storytelling. If you have a reason for it and it's like, you can do that where the character is like sobbing uncontrollably and then, you cut to them skipping down the street. That's a comedic jump. Or
exactly.
Handled correctly, that's a horror jump where it's like, oh, they fucking did it and they faked it. Like those kinds of things have to say something. There has to be a reason why you did that. If it's because you don't know what the fuck you're doing or the lighting changed from the sun or your actor did an improv thing and you really want this shot, but, everything got changed up and you just take it anyway. That's when your audience is like, whoa, what the fuck? What's going on? What did I miss?
Yeah.
And that's when problems start arising. So I think the good artists know how to break that particular rule. And so much so that you don't notice it, which I think is a tribute, because I think 180 has been broken many times in front of you. And the reason you couldn't recall it was because they knew how to get around it.
Sure. Yeah, it was probably done in such a sophisticated enough manner that I just never noticed.
Which is what you're supposed to do. And that to me is also how style emerges, right?
Sure.
Because if a rule gets broken and you don't notice it until you go back and you're thinking about it, that's when you start noticing, well, things stood out to me. They hit me harder than they normally do. And you're trying to analyze and figure out what it is. That's where the style starts emerging, where you're like, oh, so-and-so. Like Scorsese can do that in different ways. He likes to either slap you across the face with the rule that he's breaking, or you don't notice it at all. Like if you pay attention to the music cuts in his movies, they're just hard cuts on music where things normally like fade out or transition somehow. Hard cut. And it's just like, oh, well, he just stopped the music. Did they fuck that up? No. Scorsese just said stop the music. And it's like a car crash. Do you know what I mean? Like that's the experience he intended to give you. And that's where style and identity starts to emerge, is like consistently breaking the same rules is where you realize you start learning who an artist is, where they're just like, I don't give a fuck. Like you tell me I can't do this, but I don't give a fuck.
I mean, like one of my favorite musicians, and this time it isn't David Bowie. This time it's Frank Zappa.
I knew you were going to say Frank Zappa,
but he was a dedicated rule breaker, because he was. I think something that's really interesting about him too is that he actually was most interested in being like a composer. He wanted to do classical music.
Interesting.
His big influences initially were, I can't remember the name of the guy that he was most into, but people like Stravinsky, modernist composers. And he got into rock music because that was his way of making money. You know, he was like, well, this is one of the best ways that I can play music and make money. And so because of that, you get a very big variety of compositions that he does across his albums. And so you'll have an album that will have like really satirical, like goofy songs, and then at the same time later in the album, long compositional instrumentals and solos that have totally different feelings from each other. By the composition of most albums, pretty rule breaking in regards to keeping a consistent tone. You do not get a consistent tone with a lot of Frank Zappa stuff. And that, I mean, you know, he's got a bajillion. I don't even know how many albums he's made. You know, it's a ridiculous number that I can't even begin to guess. But because he was so prolific, it was very easy for him to just chunk stuff out, and he just didn't give a fuck. You know, like some albums have a consistency to them and feel like an album, and other albums are more, this is what we were working on these particular months, you know? Yeah. Like, and that's a different kind of attitude to music that not necessarily every musician has, because I think generally the rule for most albums are that you create not necessarily a concept album, but the album is strung together by a distinct mood or atmosphere or thought or theme. That's usually how most albums are put together, is at least a theme that you start off with, and then you make sure that everything within that album sticks to that theme. And like I was saying with Zappa, not every album's that way. Like, not every album has a consistent theme. A lot of them do, but a lot of times it's just like, this is literally what I was working on at this time, you know? And like I said, that attitude comes more from a, you know, somebody who's just trying to get as much stuff out there as fast as possible. Because
do you think some of his albums that do have the consistent theme are the better ones in your opinion?
Oh yeah, like Hot Rats is like one of the best albums ever in my opinion. And it's like musically, tonally very consistent throughout the album, like what the not necessarily the themes, but like what the feeling is, because there's not that many songs with lyrics, there's a couple.
Okay.
But the overall, I guess, theme in the sense of musical theme, like the melodies used, and there's often a return to similar form in those melodies, you know, makes it feel more like a suite, you know, if that makes sense.
It does.
And I think that plays into Zappa's mindset as somebody who's more looking at it as a composer, as opposed to somebody, and this is another aspect of it too, is that Zappa's band relationship was in that way where he was the conductor, the composer, he was the architect of the whole thing. Wow. Everybody in his band he paid, obviously, but he treated them as employees. They were not like bandmates, they were employees, and he was the person hiring them to make his music. So because of that, the approach is very, very different from you know, like the Beatles, where it's just like everybody's sort of, you know, trying to shoulder their way into having some part of the creative process. And so you have, you know, oh, this is a John song, this is a Paul song, this is a Ringo song, which is in itself a whole other different kind of, I mean, I'm sure at the time that was probably groundbreaking for a lot of music, because before then, a lot of artists didn't even really have that much of a sway over,
no, like, just the producers telling them, hey, you're going to do it my way, and then they all did it that way. Yeah,
exactly. Or like there would be songwriters involved, and then they just, you know, the performers, they were performers more than singers, songwriters, and that slowly changed over time.
So if you could look at it as, on your next, so okay, you've talked before about Bat Monster too, and that one kind of throws out all the
Oh,
rules.
that's entirely rule breaking. That's the whole point of it. Yeah.
And I'm not going to mince words here. You've said this before, that Bat Monster hasn't found nearly the amount of success
Oh
that
yeah.
Trailer Park Warlock has. Do you think that's because of the amount of rules that you broke?
Yeah. How could it? I cannot assume it would be for any other reason, because I mean it is an incoherent mess, intentionally an incoherent mess. And for me, I don't know how Austin feels about it, but for me, it was like an attempt at seeing how much of a story you could still tell while not paying any attention to the usual rules, you know?
Okay.
And what that means for people who read it, I have no clue, you know? But there were a lot of like creative lessons learned doing it. I don't think it's something that I'm going to be doing again, you know, because at this point I'm like, well, okay, I think I've broken all the rules that I can think of in that story. So now I'm more interested in seeing what new rules I can create for myself.
That's what I was going to get to, was the act of rule breaking in itself creates new rules. No?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly the idea, is you break rules because you're looking for either deeper rules to, you know, to create from the pieces of the shattered rules.
Mm-hmm.
I said this like I was going to have two things, but yeah, that's the main idea in my mind, is like you're trying to find a deeper rule, or a deeper, more versatile,
primal,
guideline.
universal type thing. No, absolutely. And that's what I think storytelling in general is mostly about, is finding that primal thing. Because, and this is my biggest gripe with a lot of modern filmmaking type stuff today, where, and we've talked about this before, and Lord knows in 10 years, if I'm famous, this will get me canceled, but there's a lot of requirements, business requirements now that adhere to social requirements. So there's always at least one LGBTQ character. There's always one African-American character. There's always a strong woman who has no flaw. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you have to hit all those beats, and it feels so very manufactured that it's in every single thing nowadays, right?
Yeah.
And the thing about that is if you have a prison movie, like take Shawshank Redemption, right? There are no women in that movie.
Right.
0. 1,000% no women, unless you count like Rita Hayworth on the wall. Like, that's it.
Sure.
And so if you tried to make that movie today, there would be someone that would tell you, well, Shawshank's got to have a female role. There's no women in this movie at all. We're completely isolating that particular audience by not having a representative character in this movie. They would make the warden a female, or, you know what I mean? Like, there would be some kind of character that would be made female. And on some level, I think for a lot of us, especially if the movie was still set in the 40s, or the 30s or 40s where it was originally set, that it feels inauthentic. And I think that's, even women who watch that movie would be like, no, I don't want that. I want it to be authentic, because I want to feel the universal themes here. And that's more of a distraction than it is I want to call it an appeasement, but that's not the right word. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it feels...
I definitely get what you're saying, because I mean, you compare that to something like Hamilton, which is very upfront about the rules that it's breaking in regards to how to portray
the ethnicities playing historical characters. Absolutely.
And I think that it's an interesting, I mean, like Hamilton as a musical, I'm not like the biggest fan of, just because I'm not that into the music itself.
I'm not into musicals in general because they break my reality of the story that I'm watching 9 times out of 10.
Well, what I was going to say, what I think is really interesting about it, and in regards to that rule breaking that they're doing, is like they're trying to portray that these ideas and ideals that are part of our American history go deeper than like a racial identity, or go deeper even than how we conceive of them, you know, as people. Like, these are ideas that somebody in some other country or in some other like continent would establish for themselves, given the same circumstances. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so It's interesting to see that stuff happen because it is something that I think that has actually been seen a fair amount of happening in historical dramas and other media, and I think that it is like an attempt at trying to portray that idea of like I was saying, like a perennial human nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people look, because there are a lot of people who will like dog it as like, sort of what you were saying. Well, oh, it's forced diversity or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't. That's not always the case, though. Like sometimes,
No.
just, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it can be a stylistic choice or a stylistic statement.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like how you're saying about Hamilton, it's a statement.
Oh, a great example of that is fucking. There's that version of Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio where like they refer to their guns as swords, which is a big rule break, right? Because it's like it's categorically it's like dissonant. It's like what the fuck are you saying? Like, but it makes sense if you're going to be very accurate with the Shakespearean dialogue, right?
Right.
And it's one weapon for another. What does it really ultimately matter? It ultimately means the same thing in the sense that people die when you use it, right?
Yeah.
And so that is like a common rule breaking feature when you want to break a rule to point out like you were saying, something primal, something universal, something that is deeper than just that category. Because ultimately people want to, when people do break rules, it's because they think that the rule is actually outmoded, that there is something more to the world or to reality that's actually either more interesting or more true than what that rule assumes.
I see, and that to me, that's a valid reason to break such a rule. To break a rule, like how I was talking about with my Shawshank allegory, in order to appease Twitter, is not a valid reason behind an art. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that to me is like, because if you think about some of the more controversial comedians, like you look at like Chappelle, or if you go back, could George Carlin be George Carlin today? Not a chance. Not a chance. He was talking about I watched the whole because obviously because of COVID, but the whole don't wash your hands, throw your kids into like toxic waste dumps so that they'll get genetically stronger and this and that. Like you couldn't do that today, even if he was just being tongue in cheek. You know what I mean? Like just to rile it up. And I was trying to explain this to somebody on Twitter today about they were talking about how terrible the 90s wrestling was and how like we all look back on it very nostalgically, like the Attitude Era was terrible and this and that. And then they show a couple of characters in blackface. And what I tried to explain to them, which I failed horribly at, and I'm going to again, but the 90s was a time where everyone understood things like blackface were unacceptable, they were inappropriate, they were offensive, they were demeaning, they were, you know what I mean? Like every little thing on the checklist that you want. Everyone knew this. And the reason people did it was to piss you off, was to outrage you, was to upset you. The idea of offending you was intentional because controversy back in that day before the internet, controversy is what got the news talking about you, which was what got you tuning into the show, which is what drove up the rating, which was what drove up the ad prices, which was what drove up the stock. So they didn't give a fuck. You know what I mean? Like offending you was how they made money. And it's a different world today. Everyone still knew that it was unacceptable. And that's the reason why they did it back then. Nowadays, it's a different era, not because people now know that it's unacceptable. You know what I mean? Like we've reached this long ago. Some of us more than others. I'm not going to say that, racism doesn't exist or anything these days. It very clearly does. But the vast majority of civilization knows that. And they say, and it's the same thing with like Borat. Borat came out in like 2004, I want to say. Was it back when we were in college? I don't know.
Yes.
2007, 2004, 2008, somewhere in that realm.
It
right?
was during the Bush administration, so it was
Okay, we were
at
definitely
least
yeah,
2004.
we were in college back
Yeah.
then, but it was still part of that kind of outrage culture, what he was doing, which was upsetting people. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Sacha Baron Cohen is very clearly a very liberal, like hardcore liberal person. And yet he's on camera as this character portraying someone who is very chauvinistic and demeaning towards women and this and that. And it was never here, like, he was not trying to rally call male sexist guys to be like, yeah, they got small brains. Yeah, man, you tell. Like, he was never doing that. He was lampooning it. And nowadays, if you tried to do that, if you tried to satirize something and play it up to 11, you know, Al Bundy would suddenly become the hero on TV to everybody. It's kind of, you know what I mean? But it's like, he'd be a hero to a certain subsection of society.
Sure.
And because of that, the other section of society who should very clearly know that it's satire would be like, no, we need to take this away. And that rule can't be broken anymore. That's the problem with it, is that you can't break that rule because stupid idiots will hold that up on a pedestal and be like, this is great, this is real. And everybody else that should be understanding, no, that's comedy. That's foolish. He is meant to be laughed at, not to be, you know, on Archie Bunker, all those kinds of characters. Those kinds of characters are not meant to be heroes. They're meant to be characters of warning, or do you know what I mean? Like, to be made fun of, to be mocked of, like, look at how stupid, pig-headed, and ignorant this guy is. Laugh at him. And the fact that there are people who hold those people up as heroes makes them look stupid. But the fact that other people try to take that away because they like let it be a hero, it's like, oh, now I can't make a joke about something stupid now. Now I can't, you know what I mean? And that becomes a new rule. Well, and that's what I wanted to get to, which was the rules that, not so much artistic rules, but societal rules that get enforced on art. And if you look at the greatest artists of all time, whoever, pick one. Anytime society says you can't make art about this, the great ones go, oh yeah? And then they do, like, and that's another thing that I wanted to talk about, is about rule breaking, is when you break a rule, you can't meander and like tippy-toe over it. You got to take a big step. You know what I mean? Like, I think one of the things that people really demand from artists is confidence in what they're doing. And that's a big swing. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
And I'm curious to know, so like when you did you were talking about breaking genre expectations as a rule, breaking a rule. I'm curious, you can say if you broke any other rules. Are there any big rules that you took big swings on to try something in any art, not just to Trailer Park Warlock? Is there anything where you've ever just been like, I'm going for the fence here? Because I know I have. I know in art school I took a big swing as the son of a very passionate Christian woman, and I did a charcoal drawing, and I took a image that had already been painted by someone of Christ on the cross, and it was him kind of like draped over the cross. I think he might have even been bearing it on his back. I'm not entirely sure. But instead of that, I took him in that pose and draped him over the drive-through sign, and the back was Taco Bell. And I swear to you, it was a big swing for me back then, because I was I consider, if you look at the credits end credits of Digits, I was like at the very bottom. It says, "I thank my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ." Even at that point in time, I was kind of starting to question things, but I did that because I was very much trying not to piss off my mother. So when I did Christ on the drive-through sign, that was a swing. I was taking, you know what I mean? Like, I was taking that big step over that you can't make things like that line. And I'm pretty sure my mom destroyed that piece of art because I left my art at home when I would come back for breaks and then go back to school. And after a while, I couldn't find that one. I found everything else that I ever did, but that was the one that I couldn't find when I came back from college. I don't know where it is, but it was one of my favorite pieces of art because it took a a big swing, and it felt like as an artist, I was growing. I was being braver with what I had to do. And, the result from it was personal growth, not personal gain. Does that make any sense?
Oh,
As an
yeah.
artist. So I'm curious, now that I've given you a little time to think about it, is there anything that you recall ever taking a big swing on?
I mean, for me, a personal rule that I'm glad that I broke as soon as I could figure out how to break it was not being consistent with character models in Trailer Park Warlock.
Okay.
So, and by that I mean also like I changed and grew a lot as an artist in regards to how much better I got to drawing these characters. So like you can compare certain characters at the beginning to where they are now, and they have changed. They have definitive changes. So if like for instance, there's one character, Herman, who's like a Sasquatch. His nose changes actually at a certain. There's a certain season where I changed the shape of his nose a little bit,
like drastically, like a hardcore, like, oh, he got a nose job, don't talk about it.
Yeah, it's noticeable. Like, and the same thing with another character named Bev. Like her cheek, the shape of her cheeks yeah, the shape of her cheeks changed.
the tongue twister.
Yeah. Especially because I was getting a lot of notes from people who were commenting on like her cheeks looked way too, like they were saying her face looks like an axe, and I was like, oh, okay, well maybe it's too, like I'm being too abstract in the way that I'm drawing her face.
Like too angular.
It was too the way that it curved didn't make sense in regards to just anatomy.
Okay.
So like what I ended up doing over time is just smoothing it out to where it was more of a rounded looking shape. So
that wasn't like a hardcore change, like with the nose that on Herman. That was
well,
that was more of a gradual change, you think?
I would have to look. I just know that it's something that I did. And if you had compared between season 2 and season 3, you would go, oh, whoa, something changed,
Okay.
Like,
but you made the choice to do that, is what you're saying. It wasn't just like something you subconsciously did. It was a hard choice that you made.
Absolutely. It was an intentional choice that I had made because I felt like that it would better ground everything in regards of an actual consistent style, which was something that I was trying to work towards, from season to season. And so that in turn also lends itself to like making the art look better, making it just more enjoyable to read, because otherwise it's a distraction. Like clearly it was a distraction because there were readers commenting on it. So over time I was like, okay, well, I'll change it, and then, go with that.
And I think that's the thing, is like we want distractions to be just like the rule breaking. We want the distractions to be for a reason. So if I'm distracting you from what's going on, I want you to be looking at something. You know what I mean? If I make a stark statement or a stark moment where it's, something very drastic happens, I want to break you out of whatever zone you are. Like, and I think that goes back to the spoiler for the end of this episode, which was whether you're breaking a rule or just storytelling in general, have a reason.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And part of that is, we talked about this when we talked about some of the principles of design and art, which was you have to know them before you break them so that you know why you're breaking them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And I would say, as general advice to any artist out there, if you know that you can do something, like if you're doing a story or whatever, and you know that you've immediately found some way to make it better, do it now. Like you'll just deal with the fact that your earlier work's going to look worse than your newer work. And don't worry about how people react to it, because if you know that you're doing it better, there's nothing to second guess yourself on. Just make it better, and don't worry about whether or not it's consistent.
I'm curious to know, do you think, in your opinion, it's okay for an artist to break a rule when they know that they're breaking a rule, but they don't know why, but it instinctively feels correct? We talked about, art and instinct in a prior episode, but one of the things back in art school, which we've referenced several times in this episode, there was the first year that you kind of get into your major, your soul course, and one of the assignments in the video thing was to create a self-portrait in a like a short video type thing.
Yeah.
And I remember, it was all the same shit. Somebody wakes up in bed. I've talked about this before. The film majors did all the same thing. This one guy, and I could picture him in my head right now. He kind of looked like Biz Marquis.
Okay.
And he sat the camera down. It was the very most basic thing in like his living room. And it's just him thinking over what he was going to do for his self-portrait. But he just did faces and then he did a voiceover. And one of the things that he did, he goes, I could do a Dutch angle. No. They said you need a reason to do a Dutch angle. You can't do a Dutch angle. And then at the end of the video, it's still same shot of him in the room or whatever. It's a Dutch angle, and he just looks at the camera and goes, Dutch angle, because I felt like it. And then he cut to black. And I remember that's the only one, I can't even remember what I did for that fucking assignment. But that is the only thing that sticks in my mind to this day when I think about some of the assignments that we got back in art school. And you know what I mean? Like, he broke the rule about, don't do a Dutch angle unless you feel like, or unless you have a reason for it. Yeah. And, he wasn't doing like a trippy dream sequence or something that was like out of place or something like that. His motive it was a comedic setup. It was, set up and payoff. He's like, why did you do that? Well, because I felt like it. And to me, that was a great reason. And I guess that stuck with it. But, anyone else wouldn't have thought of that. And I don't know if he knew in that moment, he went with it, but was he doing the right thing? So I'm curious to know from you, well, you're free to comment on any examples of stuff like that you've ever experienced or done yourself. But do you know what I mean? Like, do you really think an artist has to always know why they're breaking a rule? They should know that they're breaking a rule. You know what I mean? Like, know the rules, know that you're breaking it. But do they always need to know why they're breaking it? Which is what we've said this whole episode for 45 minutes that they should know. I'm curious to know, in your opinion, do they need to know why? Or can it be a guttural thing where it's just instinct, where it's like, you know what? I'm going to do this because it feels right.
I mean, if you know that you're breaking the rule, that's fine enough for me. I think that if you're intentionally breaking a rule just to see if you can create some better effect out of it or do something new, I say go for it.
Because there's that experimental aspect. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of artists, they either I don't know how to explain this, but I know as a writer, every scene that I'm writing, I'm trying to experiment with one thing or the other, because it's that constant self-doubt that comes in is this coming across? Does that work? How do I get this across? Can I try this? That's already been done a million times. Like, I can't do that again because it's just obvious. But if I try this, is that going to work? Are people going to get it? Some people didn't get things in digits. And I remember after the screening, people were like, yeah, I didn't understand why that happened. And I was like, all right, so that didn't work. And that was a lesson learned. It's like I had to learn about setups and payoffs and this and that. Spoiler alert, at the end of Digits, when Charlie's telling off the party, he has a line when he's telling off TS, and he goes, I wish I could go back in time and put you in that car with your father. And it was my assumption that everyone in the audience would just be able to pull from the ethos, the atmosphere in that room when everyone went, ooh, that something bad happened to his father in a car crash. You know what I mean? Like, it would be very obvious. And people came up to me and they're like, what happened to TS's dad? I don't understand why he said that. And to me, it was like, well, I didn't want to spoon feed that kind of information to people, but I figured a line of dialogue like that, coupled with the reaction of the party, would get the point across. Yeah. And it didn't. Yeah. It shockingly didn't to me. And I still, to this day, don't know why it didn't work. And part of me believes it's because I didn't set that up properly. But you know what I mean? Like, if I could go back in time, I would find some kind of way to set that up where TS, I don't know if he would be like visiting a grave. It would just feel out of place in that comedy movie, but you know what I mean? Or like newspaper clippings on his wall or some shit like that. Like, that's too heavy-handed for that kind of movie. But I would find some kind of way to kind of shoehorn that in there earlier on to set up that moment. So it, you know what I mean? Because I guess people trying to figure out what he was referencing took them out of the moment. So my instinct was wrong. And that was a swing that I took, but I had to learn the lesson from it. I broke that rule, I guess. I didn't know what rule I was breaking at the time because I wasn't familiar with setups and payoffs.
Yeah.
So I just, you know what I mean? And I think that was my sin, was not knowing what rule I was breaking when I was doing it.
I feel like that's oftentimes the most common kind of rule that does get broken by artists who are good at what they're doing, but they're just starting off, like when they're at the amateur state. Like I know I did a lot of that in Garage Raja.
Was that a backhanded compliment? Thank you.
But I mean, I know I did a ton of that in Garage Raja where I was like, oh, I don't have to include this particular scene. I can skip this.
Yeah.
I can leave this information out. The reader will figure it out. Only to find out when people read it, like, no, it actually is very crucial because, as it turns out, people will interpret whatever the hell they want from the information they're given, and it has nothing to do with what you would think. Because what happens is, you get into your own head about what you think somebody's going to read from it, but it's like you're the fucking person who put all this together. Of course you know.
Right.
You know everything because you've made the world, you put the whole world together or whatever. The job of the storyteller ultimately is to try and translate their head for everybody else to understand. And that's where you have to start making your own rules.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes down to I mean, there's a lot of things that we all universally experience. And there's a lot of things that we all universally don't. You know what I mean? So like, if I have, when I get pulled over by a cop, my first thought is, shit, did he see me with the cell phone? Did he see me? Was I 1 mile over?
Yeah.
Or did I forget to pay my registration? Something like that. So when I put a scene in a movie and say I'm just being colorblind and I cast a black actor as the role where he gets pulled over, and I write this scene about, the guy, fumbling for his insurance card or this or that, a lot of the white audience might think that, but they're, a lot of them are more in tune these days. But the black audience is going to be like, oh shit, we know where this is going. You know what I mean? Like,
sure.
And it's a different perspective. And if I haven't set it up where it's going to be reinforcing whatever theme or whichever direction that I'm going in with the story, if I haven't accurately set that up, like, okay, so if I had cast a black guy as TS and Digits, and I had kept everything exactly the same. When Charlie says, I wish I could go back in time and put you in that car with your father. For all we know, the black audience members would have immediately grabbed, oh, his dad got pulled over by the cops and got shot dead, which is not what the intention was. Like the dad got into a car crash and got killed. So by casting an actor of color in that role, I have changed what the audience is interpreting in that moment. So unless I've set up that perspective initially, I can't control how it is, and everybody's trying to figure out what the hell's going on. So it's that kind of balance where I didn't realize the setups and payoffs. I needed to provide a certain amount of information to guide the audience to that point without shoving it down their throat. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's why most of the rules get established in the first place, is just to say,
it's helping you out.
Whenever you're telling a story, this is the information you just have to have all the time. Regardless of whether or not you think you can get away with it, you can't get away with it. Just know this,
Well, I mean, and that's the thing, is like, it's not about getting away with it, I don't even think. I think it's about if being effective with what you are trying to do, with your intention as an artist. You know what I mean? Because we have to be control freaks to some extent. We can't be too willy-nilly and abstract about things, because then it's beautiful when things are open to interpretation sometimes. Like that's not something to be discounted.
Yeah.
But more often than not, abstract stuff just it creates conversation. It allows you to fill whatever you want into it. It's like wish fulfillment. It's whatever. But as an artist, I know personally for me, I want to say things through my art. And if I leave things too open-ended or too unsubstantiated or whatever it may be, I'm not doing my job. And you know what I mean? Like, and that's kind of the thing, is like, I need to do my job. It's very important to understand that sometimes, as much as you might want to, you shouldn't break the rules.
Yeah, and I think that if you look at how the direction of for lack of a better description, gallery art has gone over the last 100+ years.
Yeah.
There was a point, around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. I guess that's the proper way of saying it. Like around the 1900s, where the whole momentum became about what rules can we break, and it just constantly became about rule breaking, to the point that where art just sort of becomes, suddenly you have artists whose whole thing is, I've made a statue and there's actually nothing there. It's just a contract that I sold to somebody for like,
It's a
18,000. Yeah.
Yeah.
At that point, it's like, well, then why are we even here? It's the same reason why the reason you play a game is because there are rules that actually make the game possible. The game is structured by rules. If you don't have rules, you don't have anything to play. You just are living life. So in the same way, art requires some kind of rule that makes it art, as opposed to life. And one of the main rules is that it is distinct from life, in the sense of, it's removed from your daily experience. It's removed from ordinary experience. It's outside of that. So starting from there, you have to establish everything else. Which I guess is the reverse of breaking rules, is you just start from no rules at all and then go from there, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is actually, I think mentally that's actually how I operate most of the time. Is I operate from a place of, okay, there's no rules, now where do we go? And I think it is in my opinion, it's a more interesting way to approach art, because it allows you to observe things I think that it's a more creative approach.
Okay, absolutely.
It involves more experimentation. It involves the possibility of different paths being open and different venues being open. And I've been thinking a lot about this lately in regards to how, like, people philosophically live their lives. Because something that I think is actually, not to get too much of a rabbit hole, but something that I think that's actually kind of missing societally nowadays is like the concept of virtue. And not just like being nice to people, but like an actual fucking ideal. In other words, why are you alive and what do you live for? Like, what are the things that wake you up in the morning, and what are the things that you are focused on as an individual? Forget about the rest of society, but you as an individual, what are you focused on making happen? And so, like, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, like, okay, for me personally, what are my virtues? What are the things that I hold as a higher ideal that, for me, I want to form habits around, I want to form discipline around, I want to use as a means for living a life? Because that's one of the first key ways that you can live your life as an art form, is to have a virtue or have a set of, maxims or whatever. And they can change, by the way. Like, that's why I was starting off this whole thing with the idea of, well, okay, think about where you are with no rules and then build from there. And that doesn't work for everybody, but for me it works. And it works because I think I want to imagine the world in new ways. And that's part of how I end up telling stories, right? That's how I end up making my stories, is like trying to perceive the world from a different, cockeyed perspective or whatever. So anyway, very rambly what I'm trying to say here, but my whole point is, I think there's a lot of potential that comes from rule breaking. But if you're going to break all the rules, make sure that you have the foresight to also rebuild on that ground, because you're going to end up with just, bare land at some point.
I was thinking while you were talking was that the more rules you decide to break as an artist, the more you risk failure. Like there's a middle ground where if you follow all the rules, you're safe, right?
Yeah.
And in that safe zone is almost everybody. And then there are people who decide to break rules and they are considered failures or giant successes. Right?
Yeah.
So I feel like the more rules you break or the bigger rules you break, you can fall into one of those two categories, but you're going to go into one of those categories. And it's really about the artist making decisions about, is it worth it taking this particular risk, breaking this rule? Do you know what I'm saying? Like you really have to, because I mean, you've talked before about how Bat Monster didn't find the same audience that Trailer Park Warlock did. I'm not going to sit here and call Bat Monster a failure because you could probably give a shit less about how many people tuned into Bat Monster.
Yeah,
and
Bat
you know
Monster,
what I mean?
definitely, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like your intention could have just been, this is going to be an art exploration and I'm going to learn personal things from this. And, you know, if I have 5 fucking viewers, maybe 2 of them are artists and they will learn from this. And that to me might be the success. You know what I mean? Like, or I made a connection or someone got into this or one person. I remember I got a letter. One person wrote me a letter that said that that Digits distracted them for 2 hours while they were getting divorced. And like, to me, that made the movie a success.
Oh yeah.
So people throw it in my face all the time when they're fucking mad at me. They'll be like, oh, Digits was a failure. And this, I'm like, no, it fucking wasn't. Because some guy was depressed because his wife, left him or whatever. And he told me that I rescued him for 2 hours. And that to me meant the world. You know what I mean? And, stroke my ego a little bit. There were times when I was walking around in the mall and people would identify me and go, that's the Digits. Are you the Digits guy? And I'd be like, yeah, that's me. Oh, that's awesome, man. I loved your movie. I'm like, that's great. Who the fuck are you? And I'm not going to lie. As an artist, at that point in my artistry or my artist growth, that's, I did seek that celebrity. I did seek that validation from strangers and I got that. So to me, making a ton of money, which we only made almost exactly our money back that we spent on that movie. We didn't make any profit. That to me was the success. And those were the risks that I took. Cause I took a lot of risks with that movie. That Heath Ledger joke that opens the movie, that was a fucking swing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you don't do that. And, now you look at that and it's probably very tame because so much time has passed that it's still very crude and upsetting joke to some people.
That joke would have been a much bigger rule break nowadays than it was at that time.
You think?
Oh yeah, because there are comedians who have done too soon jokes and gotten themselves almost canceled on it nowadays.
Really?
Like I was surprised to find that out.
From like tragedies, we're not talking like just controversial stuff. We're talking about like tragic too soon jokes.
Yeah. There was a comedian who had like done a too soon joke about like Kobe Bryant after he had passed away, and like he got a lot of heat about it. So
really,
like,
was it Anthony Jeselnik by any chance?
No,
because he's one of my favorites.
In that group of people, but not him.
Okay, I'm shocked to hear you say that. But even then, like, I remember sitting in that theater when the movie premiered, going, holy shit, he's gonna say the joke in 8 seconds. Oh god, am I gonna get strung up in this theater? And when the joke hit, a couple people laughed, but not the audience, and I immediately thought, shit, I fucked up. Like this is a failure. Because if that joke hit, the rest of the movie would work because those kinds of jokes are just littered throughout it. There's terrible like rape jokes and just chauvinistic jokes and ableist jokes, the Helen Keller, like all that kind of shit is just terrible. And I sat there thinking, damn it, I flew too close to the sun. I swung too big. This is going to fail. What I didn't realize was the audience wasn't expecting that. Yeah. So they needed to adjust in that moment. So I really needed to stay. This goes back to what I was talking about taking a big step and committing to the rule breaking, which was the audience needed to adjust to understand that's what they were in for, because that really didn't get advertised in any of the trailers or promotion
Sure.
that I did for the movie.
Sure.
And when the next couple offensive jokes started rolling out, more and more people were laughing. They were hitting. And I realized, okay, that's going to work now. So on repeat watches, I'm sure people probably watch. But by the time we got to the end of the movie, when there was the Ryan Dunn joke as the tag after the credits, I wasn't sweating. Like, I knew that one was going to hit. I'm glad that we took out not the Helen Keller, the Anne Frank joke, because I think that we went a touch too far. Did you see that?
Go pretty radioactive over time.
Yeah, it was, and that wasn't even my idea, that particular joke. But I'm glad that I took that one out, because that one just didn't sit right. Because while a lot of the jokes can be considered mean, that one felt really hurtful. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Sure.
There's a difference between a guy who tragically dies in a car crash and, a character making fun of that, and a whole population of people being exterminated. You know what I mean? And that's a poor choice of words right there. But that is, how the approach of Hitler and his whole fucking idiots were doing it.
Yeah.
And it never sat right with me. Like, I'm sure you could make a joke as a comedian about the Holocaust and make it funny. I'm sure Jewish comedians do it all the time, and they found out ways, and they kind of have a right more than I do to make those jokes. But that one never felt right to me. So that was, at that time, and even now, that was a rule that I didn't want to break, that social construct of, making a joke about the Holocaust. That was the swing I didn't want to take. And I feel like that's an important lesson for a lot of artists to know, is like, pick and choose which rules you're breaking.
Oh, yeah.
Because
the thing also about comedy in particular is so much of comedy is also about rule breaking anyway.
Absolutely.
So much of comedy is about saying what you usually wouldn't say in society, or what is not acceptable. Not all, obviously, but like, definitely the comedy that thrives in our current era thrives on trying to say what can't be said, or to skirt as close to that line as possible and find out where too far is. Because that's where all the laughter is, because it's like built on tension, and the tension that gets built up is built up on the idea of, oh, they're not going to say that, there's no way they're going to say that, and then they say something so close to it that you go, holy shit. So
but that's kind of always been comedy. Like, if you listen to like Rich Voss albums, are you familiar with Rich Voss at all? So Rich Voss is a Jewish New Jersey comedian, and he's like one of the best stand-ups in the game. Not a lot of people know his name, but if you talk about him in the comedic circles, like stand-up comedy circles, everybody knows who Rich Voss is. Hilarious. One of the jokes that I remember him telling, he tells a joke about being in an airport, and he says, it was like close to 9/11. He was like, over the loudspeaker, it goes, if you see anything suspicious, contact the authorities. Right then and there, I saw a black guy leaving a tip. And the joke is that black people don't tip. But the thing was, the audience laughs. And the first thing he does is yell at the audience and go, don't look over there to see if the black guy is laughing. Because that's what, you know what I mean? Like, that's kind of what you were talking about, where you go up to that line, but some comedians step over it. The whole point of it is, and this goes back to the Sacha Baron Cohen thing and even Digits and all that stuff, is people will do things to get the rise out of you. And it's not that it's ill intent. It's just that it's kind of like breaking the ice. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like we're all acknowledging something awkward or something terrible. And the fact that you're not supposed to speak about it, and someone speaks about it, it's like, oh, let's laugh because that'll, alleviate the situation. And that's what people try to do to kind of loosen people up and do this and that. But I guess we're off topic a little bit. I guess rule breaking, we could.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, when we're talking about breaking rules, something that something that does kind of bother me as a general contemporary thing that's happening is the rules that are being put in place lately are trying to keep people from talking about things more and more.
Yes.
And it's disturbing to me because as we talked about earlier, like, so much of the 90s was about trying to break down barriers and break down about what you could say, what you could and couldn't say.
Right.
And try and be more and more explicit, more and more
Open.
more and more open. And that openness, I really see missing a lot in modern day culture. And art suffers because of it.
Yes.
Like, absolutely suffers. And not just comedy, not just like any particular art, like all of it. And I anxiously await for rule breakers to come out to just totally toss all that over the wall, because I feel like we went through so much getting into that first 20 years of, our lives, 20 plus years of lives, to suddenly see it just go away like that. It makes me appreciate, the art of those older decades more. But at the same time, I think a lot about, what's missing nowadays and what I think we would all benefit from, because there are conversations that are not taking place, that I think people want to take place and want to talk about and want to just be earnest about. And the lack of earnestness in modern day culture leads to anxiety, leads to paranoia, leads to, all sorts of conspiracy and hate and just ill feelings towards each other.
To clarify, though, we're not saying that, you should legally be allowed to yell fire in a crowded room.
No, absolutely
not. That's absolutely not, unless there is a fucking fire, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But see, that's where it gets really kind of fitzy, because if someone, you can't these days because of the way the laws are with smoking inside, but if someone sparks a lighter in a crowded room and someone shouts fire, they're not lying. They're not, you know what I mean? Like, they are going to cause a panic, but they're not saying something that's untruthful. But versus the whole curtain is on fire uncontrollably is an entirely different matter. So in public, things like that need to be regulated. I can't say that enough. Like, freedom of speech is one thing, but there is a certain line where you endanger people's lives. Like, you can talk about
also like defamation and libel are real things that I think people really need to understand exist in the world. And something that another aspect of modern day culture that blows my mind is that a lot of people, that concept does not occur to them, that people might make up things about people.
Yeah, and it's usually an unfortunate situation where the first person to make an assertion is the one that's believed. Right. You ever notice that? Like, the first, whether it be an accusation or anything else, the first thing that is said is the first thing that's believed.
Well, it's not even that it's believed; it's that anything else that's said that is counter to that is disbelieved. And
right.
That to me is so counter to any sort of notion of logic or reason, or even just the way our justice system works, where you're allowed, where both parties are allowed to express their perceptions, their experience, and allow people to decide, based on the evidence.
Right.
That to me is disturbing, because that's like a breakdown of reason, and if we don't have reason, what do we have? It's just like society collapses at that point.
Right. So, and that's why I think it's important to say that, like, in real life, there needs to be regulation about how things are handled, but art should not be regulated.
Right.
That's why art kind of exists, is
exactly
to have that, I want to call it safe. It's a safer medium to discuss more, not so much controversial, but to, other avenues, other ideas, things like that. Like, you can't, in a Twitter discussion, you can't read tone, you can't read face, you can't read a lot of things. You can't say more than 140 fucking characters. So how can you articulate a complex point to, you know what I mean, to sustain an argument or whatever? So the idea is that is what art is supposed to be for. Now, don't get me wrong. It's also for entertainment's sake,
right.
A reprieve from the shit that we're all dealing with in our lives day to day.
Of course.
But in that, art is the forum where these ideas are allowed to be put in conflict with each other.
Art is the one place where we should be allowed to break all of society's rules because it doesn't impact society. That's the whole fucking point from the beginning of like having stories, of having entertainment, is this is a place for you to explore outside of society's rules so that when you go back into society, you don't feel threatened by it in the same way.
If you go back to like Grimm fairy tales and, you know, Aesop's fables and all that kind of stuff, like they're discussing moral ethics, stuff like that. You know what I mean? Through a subtext. No one's saying you should throw kids into the oven. Like, that's not the point of the fucking, you know what I mean? Like, we're having a different discussion here. This is just the clothes that it's wearing. And it bothers me when we have art and people are trying to censor it. Not even just government or business, when society itself. So that's why I have a real big problem with any kind of organization, whether it be fucking KKK or PETA or what everything in between. Like when these organizations start having say over what can and cannot be produced and the masses support it, that's when I start getting scared. Not even as an artist, as a human fucking being, where it's like, no. You don't get to tell me what I can and cannot say in my art. I am presenting a point of view. I'm presenting an argument. And I'm sustaining it with whatever else happens in that fucking form of art. If you disagree, what you should do is make your own goddamn art that illustrates your point of view. And you know what I mean? Like, art is the thing that guides society. And for so long, there have been controls about what art is acceptable and what art is not. You look at things like pornography, like they tried to shut down pornography at one point. That's a rule break, right? Somebody said, I'm going to have fucking on camera. And somebody said, no, you're not. And like at one point, they couldn't even show a toilet flush on a, you know what I mean? And Hitchcock was like, yeah, no, we're going to show the toilet flush. Why? Because we're going to show a toilet flush.
For the longest time, I think this was I Love Lucy, where it was like the idea of having a single bed for
a married couple.
That was like a rule break because you weren't supposed to acknowledge that like two people might sleep in the same bed and have sex. Like that was not allowed, you know, societally. And I think that's, you know, a lot of people want to blame this on like a younger generation or whatever. I don't know who to blame. I don't know if spreading blame is even worth the effort. I just know and acknowledge that there are changes happening right now in society. And I just think like, can y'all just like look back though and look at the history and take a look and like just acknowledge that I don't want to fucking go back to that. I don't think anybody does.
Nope.
So like let's go back on track where we were going and let's deal with it like adults and deal with it as like sane people and you know, there are probably going to be you know, forms of art, forms of entertainment. They're going to be videos streamed that we're going to say, no, we don't want that to happen. Like, I don't want to fucking see a mass shooting be projected, you know, on Facebook. Like, I would say that's a rule that got broken that, like, let's never break that one ever fucking again, you know? Like, that's one that we don't need to go back to. Point being, like, we've got to have the conversation though when these things happen, and we've got to be able to take on it in a mature way. Which I mean, the internet being what it is, that's a big ask, right?
Right. The problem though comes in when the censorship comes down because there's always different perspectives on every single thing that happens, and even if it's not like a societal thing, like if you put a counter video, like if you make a short film that. You know, okay, so there's gun violence, right? Nobody should, you know, nobody, I God forbid, anybody be in favor of school shootings. No one, I can't think of anyone in their right mind that would be. But on the same side, when you have something like, okay, so there was a home invasion in Connecticut once where they did have a gun in the house, and after the invaders had I believe they raped and killed the mother and maybe one of the daughters. I think there was multiple daughters. The father was able to get a gun and shot the home intruders and saved the other daughter and himself. And he couldn't have done that without having a firearm in the house. So if somebody made a short film about that particular instance in favor of, gun rights, then all of a sudden you put it on YouTube and YouTube says, well, no, this isn't endorsing guns and we don't support that. Then it's like, well, wait a minute. This actually happened too. Like someone did shoot up a school and they did a terrible thing. They murdered like 30 kids. That's horrible. On the other hand, this guy over here saved half of his family by having a gun. Like these points of view need to be acknowledged so that we can find the right middle ground where we can understand what we should do as a society. And it's sad when companies, governments, organizations, whatever it may be, can have that say where it's like, no, you can't have that. Even in this world where we have every bit of distribution, that is still there. And so the idea of breaking that rule of you can or cannot do that, to me, is like essential. That's the number one thing. Is like you need to have that discourse, but you need to have it in an area where it's not going to create problems. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a difference between making a joke about something and handing someone an AR-15 that's got mental handicaps and pointing them at a school. Like there are two very different situations there. And it gets muddied in the waters because people just try to win. And that's part of the problem with, I think, what a lot of societies that we're in what's the word I'm looking for here? It's a part of capitalism, competition. Everything's in competition with one another. And it's about winning. It's always about winning. And it's not about finding the right way. It's about winning. And a lot of people get lost in that. It's like a drug. And I think that's an issue. But I think that's the problem, is that in art, you need to be brave and you need to break rules that you know should be broken. You should know why they're being broken, or for what intent, I guess you could say. I don't know. I feel like we're getting way off topic now. But
I mean, it is off topic in a manner, but it is related, right? It is about, ultimately, we are talking about all
censorship,
of the rules.
yeah, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, absolutely, because it's art. Art is rule breaking in its essence.
Yeah, that's how I feel like, because like I said earlier, like art is all about rule breaking because society is all about rule
enforcing.
Yeah, enforcing.
Sure.
And that's something that as long as you live in a society, you're not going to be able to get away from ever.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a structure that helps helps us from descending into chaos.
Yeah.
But at the same time, some of these rules do need to get broken, because there's fucking laws that you can't walk backwards while holding a pigeon in a public park in Connecticut or some shit. Like, you know what I mean? Like, who the fuck wrote that law? Like, come on. So yeah, you got to look at these things, and as an artist, you have to make a decision to break rules. That's the bright side, is that there is no artist jail. So if we're looking at it like laws, there is no artist jail. They can say there's movie jail if you can make a bad movie, or if if you're a comedian and you say something too hot button and you quote unquote get canceled. My stomach just turned saying that out loud. You can choose not to be that these days. You know what I mean? Like, I know Louis C.K. is still trying to climb his way back up. And the damage may be done to him that he can't undo. But it's interesting to me that people like Dave Chappelle are just like, no. I'm not going anywhere. I'm sorry. I'm not going to take a knee to you. I'm not going to kiss your feet or kiss the rings or apologize. I'm going to keep doing what I believe is right. And it's that weird, again, that confidence thing that comes with rule breaking, is that if you step far enough over the line confidently, people will rally behind you, and you can change the course that society is taking, but you have to be brave enough to do it. And as artists, I think it is kind of our responsibility to not only break those rules, but also, because we all have conversations in our heads as artists, I think we do, and to explore those, what our decisions well before we make them. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Like, we talked about not knowing why you're breaking the rule, but at the same time, when you're making certain decisions to break rules as an artist, you should have thought it through quite a bit, especially which rules you're breaking and how hard you're breaking them.
Yeah,
I feel like that's important, especially because we live in such a world where feedback is going to be immediate. And if you haven't thought through your position on why you broke that rule or what you're saying, they're coming for you. And if you can't defend it, you have just wasted your own time, diminished your reputation as an artist, and not accomplished whatever goal you were after, which to me, that's a failure as an artist. So it's important to me as an artist to have thought through my positions, and whether they're, be political, sociological, whatever it may be, I have to have thought it through to know I can defend this. And even in defending it, I will be making a better point than I'm already making. And I think that's important for all artists to do. So I don't want to say don't break rules just to break them, because I go back to Dutch angle because I felt like it. And then at the same time, I want to say break them and not know, or and know what you want to do. So it's that weird dichotomy, and I guess you got to figure that out as an artist yourself. But that's where I land on the subject. Mr. Rainwater, I leave it to you if you've got anything else to add.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you will not suffer from society if you break the rules of art. You only suffer from society by breaking society's rules. So don't be afraid of breaking rules, but also, like you were saying, Joe, understand why you're breaking them. And then also, more importantly, get feedback on what happens when you do break them. Don't just like keep to your own perspective of it, but ask somebody else, see what they think about it. If it's a hit, if it works, then you got something, But don't just stay within your own tunnel vision, when you're doing that.
Absolutely. Art comes from living a life and keeping an open perspective. So one of those perspectives is that could be you were wrong, and it's okay. It's okay to be that. Till next time, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Hour and a half. We're going to stop it there. I'm sure we could revisit this at some other point, but this has been a great talk. Mr. Rainwater, thank you as always.
Yeah.
And we will see you guys next week. Good night.
Good night.